Let me start by clarifying a few of the assumptions and start by asking a couple of questions. Assumption number one, the fact that there would be a US retrenchment from Europe is not going to happen, regardless of what anyone wants to do or what anyone desires to do. It is simply, to come out of NATO means to come out of a treaty, and to amend a treaty means to go to the Congress. And have you seen the Congress recently? Good luck. That is not going to happen. One of the reasons why dormant NATO is it stirred up so much panic in Europe is it bypasses the biggest firewall towards from retrenchment, the US Congress. At the end of the day, troop movement is presidential prerogative and executive power. It has already happened before in 1993, by the way, where American troops were 330,000 in Europe, and within 2 years it was down to 66. That doesn't need the Congress. It's logistical. It could happen tomorrow. It could happen within one presidential season. Assumption number two, the fact that retrenchment, any kind of retrenchment in Europe would lead to European Union being a superpower is also not going to happen. America, Washington, D.C.'s foreign policy has been many things, but one thing has been constant, and to imagine a situation where there is a European Union as a unitary superpower under one flag and one army and one theology is unthinkable in DC. At the end of the day, we are realists, and we have to understand that there are some things which is prudential, and which are some things which are not expedient. This is one of the things that is not expedient. That doesn't mean that you cannot shift the burden to Europe. It just means that you cannot shift the burden by virtue of thinking that the European Union would be a unit that takes the burden out of the American hands. Number three, NATO, there was this quote in 1990, and John mentioned Margaret Thatcher, so obviously I just gave the game away. The quote was by Thatcher to Gorbachev that West must find ways to give the Soviet Union confidence that its security would be assured. That was in 1990 in London, in the NATO summit. The same speech was repeated by James Baker, Manfred Werner, Helmut Kohl, Margaret Thatcher, Mitterrand, George H.W. Bush, and finally by John Major, who, when asked by the Soviet Marshal Dmitry Yazov, said that nothing of that sort is going to happen. Now, does that mean that Russia is not a revanchist power, or, as John mentioned, that, you know, I actually do believe that Russia is a revanchist power. But there are two other additional qualifiers to that statement. One, you can be revanchist, but threat is intention plus capability. As one of my history professors always reminded me, I use that in my speeches all the time, I can intend to be James Bond, but I'm short and I can't run. So intention doesn't mean that you're capable of being a hegemonic threat. Russia, by no means, a country that lost 40,000 troops in Hostomel in 2022 February, is not a hegemonic threat. There are threats from Russia, of course, but there are different kinds of threats. It's not the Soviet Union. It's definitely not the Third Reich. There were 90,000 troops crossing Europe, crossing Ukraine in 2022. Compared to Operation Barbarossa, there were 4 million Germans crossing to Ukraine. Think about the numbers. At the end of the day, war is mathematics. It's not ideology. It's mathematics. Now, to get back to my speech. Unipolarity is something which is not considered in political science. At the end of the day, if you have a theory, if your theory cannot answer the exceptions, then you don't really have a good theory. Your fundamental theory, if your theory is realism, and your theory is that NATO expansion has led to Russian reaction, which is why Russia is going to war, then that doesn't really explain the exceptions as to why Russia is not going to war in Finland or Montenegro or Macedonia, and why is Russia going to war in Syria. No, Russia is going to war because the places Russia is going to war, Russia has direct strategic interest. Not Montenegro, not the Baltics, not Macedonia, not Poland, but in Ukraine, in Crimea, in Georgia, in Syria. In Syria, Russia has a warm water port. If you read the Russian military literature for the last 20 years that I've done, then you would see that every single military journal in Russia has been talking about places of direct strategic interest. That doesn't mean that they don't worry about NATO expansion. They do. They're going to raise a lot of noises, but they're probably not interested or capable of doing stuff in other parts. Which brings to the final topic as to my speech was the idea of how to reform NATO. I don't think that NATO needs to be dissolved. I don't think that's doable, but I also don't think that's a good thing to do. At the end of the day, NATO is a very successful alliance. If you can go back to 1989, it's going to be very good. The Germans had 12 divisions in Germany at that point of time. Let Germany pay for 12 divisions in NATO, and we wouldn't have this conversation tomorrow. But some of the things that has happened in NATO is a product of unipolarity, which is a variable that people don't really talk about, especially realists who are structuralists by design. They don't really talk about domestic level variables, and that's one of the variables is unipolarity. Unipolarity makes people dumb. You know, you don't face the kind of challenges that you do. You take risks that you shouldn't. You don't think of one of the biggest issues of imperial collapse is overstretch and insolvency. You don't think about those things. That's the same thing that happened to Britain. You know, when it was the offshore balancer for almost 90 years, and it led to the rise of other powers which it couldn't stop because it was the one taking the burden of the seas and of the naval facilities and all that kind of stuff. And that is something which we need to figure out. America faces the exact same challenges. It is going to be a challenge for America. It's going to be a challenge in 200 years' time and for a different hegemon. But it is going to be there. That is a challenge. You don't lead your life without prioritizing. Why would you lead an alliance without prioritizing theaters? You need to think of that. So this is not about dissolving NATO. That is a misunderstanding of my position. It is about reforming NATO to the point where NATO can exist with a more balanced new structural integrity and more new security architecture. So one of the things that happened was, because of the unipolarity, a new strategic posture, it atrophied local allies, and it included sanctimonious protectorates. So if you, for those of you who are historians, if you read the history of Rome, it's like the Federati. You know, you have your petty ethnic rivalries, and you're trying to bring the hegemon to take part in those. That is not something which is in the interest of the hegemon, and that is not something which is in the interest of the United States. The immediate result of NATO expansion, as I've written, has been the decline in capabilities of the Western European states, who do not foresee, rightly, that any major strategic or hegemonic threat rising in the East, Russia, even though it is a shadow of the former self, but most of the American manpower and logistics, on the other hand, guard some of the Eastern states, who are also, by definition, some of the more hawkish. There is, and I've spoken this thing in the embassies when I spoke with some of the ambassadors. Incidentally, if you see it that way, like there are a whole bunch of social political difference between, say, Germany and Denmark and Hungary, whereas there is there's kind of like a consensus when it comes to social conservative politics when it comes in eastern parts of Europe. But when it comes to foreign policy, it is a matter of geography. There are a lot of alignments between, Denmark or some of at least one side of the German political spectrum, and some of the countries in Eastern Europe which don't want to go to war in Ukraine or even want to continue. I do, by the way, not as much. I would rather share the burden with Europe, but I actually do think spending money in Ukraine is a good thing. Having said that, there are countries in the alliance which are far more hawkish compared to US, and it's perfectly reasonable and understandable by realism. If you are a small state and your primary interest is security, and if you're a security maximizer, what are the two things that you should do? One, you would try to chain gang the hegemon. Two, you would try to grow the institution. When an institution grows, whose power declines the most? It's not the small states. It's too many cooks problem. It's the hegemons. The relative power of the hegemon declines when the institution increases. Second, an institution, if it increases, what is the first challenge that the institution faces? It cannot have a coherent strategic interest. You cannot have a coherent strategic interest which is primarily based on geography. If your entire geography is constantly mutating, it is not going to happen. It's theoretically impossible. So, to conclude, and I'm happy to talk more about that in the question and answer sessions, which I'm sure I'm going to be the one facing the most. History is rarely monocausal, but for the sake of policy formulations, there are a few linear conclusions that could be drawn from that. One, Russia is a reactive power, not a revanchist power. There's a difference. Russia could be revanchist. It's not capable of being revanchist, but it is a reactive power, and it would react in places where its direct strategic interests are directly aligned. It might not react in other places, but it would. Now, whether to react to that reaction is a political calculation, and I'm not in place to answer that question because it's not my job. But make no mistake that Russia would react to places, to provocations in its area. Well, we are going to do the exact same thing in Cuba. If tomorrow China has a base in Cuba, we expect the same thing to happen. Second, sorry, I think all right. The history of the NATO-Russia relations were not etched in stone. There were signs of alignments. One of the first phone calls, for example, George W. Bush got was from Putin. Why? Because at that point of time, three different things happened. One, the bases in Central Asia, which US wanted, was a kind of like a bargain chip that Russia introduced us to. In return, we are the ones who said we're going to turn a blind eye because Russia is facing its own Chechen problem. So we have seen in history evidence where there has been, a kind of like a grand bargain between the US and Russia. I don't think that's possible anymore. I don't think Putin believes us. I don't think we believe him. But there has been situations. Why did that happen? Because it is a reactive power. If it's a reactive powers are by definition realist. If you are a realist and reactive power, you would answer to incentives. And that is one of the things which I've seen before. So a couple of policy prescriptions that I would suggest if I was to have a reformed NATO. One of the policy prescriptions would be to close the gate. That doesn't mean retrenchment. That doesn't mean throwing out people. That doesn't mean not defending states which are part of the treaty alliance. But it means closing the gate. If you are in a nightclub, you need to be inside the club. If you want to go out of the club, punch someone, and then come back and want the bouncer to defend you, you're a moron. You shouldn't expect that. Close the gate, pull up the drawbridge. You're done. We haven't been able to define the boundaries of Europe for the last 20 years. Well, Vladimir Putin defined it for us. That is it. That doesn't mean that we are not going to defend people or countries which are inside NATO, but that is not to say that, we shouldn't, at the end of the day, if you are in America, and if you think of the interest of the hegemon, you shouldn't listen to those states which would want to pull you to their rivalries. It's not in your interest. That is one of the things. That doesn't mean that NATO needs to dissolve tomorrow, but you need to be cognizant of small states and their interests. Chain ganging is a bigger problem for America than buck passing. Second, the bureaucracy. NATO can remain and be in a reformed posture without, I don't even want to go into the details, but have you seen the tweets that's coming out of the NATO Twitter account? Go and have a look. If you think that those are, Dan McCarthy, I see he's laughing at me, but if you see that those are the things that NATO needs to do, then good luck, that is not going to fly. Why will not that fly? For a simple political reason. If you are an institution and your fundamental raison d'etre is defense, if you choose the side if you choose one of the political sides of the hegemon, then by definition, you would face that political side being opposed to you. I don't think it's prudent politics. NATO can remain a defensive alliance without taking part of some of the, social issues, for example. So that's my second political suggestion, that the social issues of NATO, the bureaucracy needs to be curtailed. In conclusion, so in conclusion, I would like to suggest that NATO's expansion's biggest long-term result, and this brings back to my earlier assumption. Like I said, I started with the assumptions first because I didn't think that I'd be responding first before I go to my speech. But one of the things that is the long-term result of NATO is the destruction of the traditional interests of bigger powers, of the hegemon especially, but also of the different bigger powers. If you think that Europe as a whole would have a set of interests and America would be just happy about it, that is not going to happen. But that also doesn't mean that America would be there and Europe is not going to share its burden. So fundamentally, again, it's about geography. And one of the things that we could do to do burden sharing is not talk about burden sharing, but institute burden shifting in certain domains while keeping the bigger things to ourselves. That is how you create a new security architecture. That means you don't let West Europe buck pass. You do not let East Europe chain gang. You have a new, a broad understanding. You don't have to, just, go out and try and amend the treaty. None of that things should happen. But fundamentally, you should be aware that there are states which have got their own interests, and good for them. But if you're in America and if you're figuring out American foreign policy, after 33 trillion in debt and several failed wars and nation building, I think you need to understand that Bridge Colby is right. There is a rising power in the East, and in order to do that, you need to prioritize the theaters. And one of the ways to do that is to start with the continent, which is the richest and which is an allied continent to the US. I think I should probably stop there. Yeah, thank you.